Rise Attire and In Pursuit of Truth proudly present the official IPOT signature series, Pursuity Wave. Let's take a look. Oh yeah, you know that's right. Grab your coffee, stretch those hamstrings, fist bump your neighbor. It's going down.
This is Sir Patrick Mack, and I approve this message. Christmas, a season for glad tidings and good cheer. A time to gather with loved ones, burn the Yule log, and exchange gifts in celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ in a manger in a little town of Bethlehem. What are the origins of such celebrations? Celebrations so rich with symbolism that it should be obvious to all those who observe what many call the most wonderful time of the year. Are the traditions of Christmas related to the birth of Christ? What is Christmas spirit? And does it have anything to do with the Spirit of Christ? Would Jesus have celebrated Christmas? What does God have to say about the birth of Jesus? How is it that we know so little about the origins of a holiday we all know so well? Are these rituals, songs, symbols, and behaviors celebrating the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Or something much more sinister? What does God have to say about Christmas? In this episode, we explore just some of the roots and symbols behind the world's most marketed holiday, and we continue our story into the ancient beginnings of end-time evil, and how it all eventually intertwines, and what that might mean for the future of humanity.
The solar system was organized by forces operating inward from the great ring of the Saturnian sphere, and since the beginning of all things were under the control of Saturn. The most reasonable inference is that the first forms of worship were dedicated to him and his peculiar symbol, the stone. Thus, the intrinsic nature of Saturn is synonymous with that spiritual rock which is the enduring foundation of the solar temple and has its antitypic or lower octave in that terrestrial rock, the planet Earth, which sustains upon its jagged surface the diversified genera of mundane life. Remember that Saturn is the chief of the Elohim, and that he is the eldest of the 7 planets, or Chaldean gods. It is Saturn who says, "In the beginning, let there be a firmament in the midst of the deep." When the first day of manifestation or remanifestation begins, the Saturnine principle of crystallization dominates space, and the firmament is manifested.
Saturn is, I would say, after my research over the years, is fundamental to understanding how this, quote, bad copy became our fake reality and continues to be so. First of all, Saturn was widely worshipped in the ancient world. Question, why would it be when we can hardly frickin' see it? Never mind what the ancients could do. Well, there's a story about why. This, as we see it today, wasn't always like it was, and in geologically very recent times, it wasn't like this.
For those who celebrate Christmas, the winter season often evokes memories of family, friends, gifts, food, music, and for Christians, the birth of Christ. Celebrated on December 25th at the end of the winter solstice. The winter solstice occurs between the 20th and 23rd of December, depending on the year, and has been observed since the Neolithic era, or around 10,000 BC. Monuments such as Newgrange in Ireland are aligned with the sunrise on the solstice, showing a reverence for capturing the sun on the shortest day of the year. And ancient Romans held month-long festivals leading up to the solstice. This event was called Saturnalia. Drunken orgies, parades, games, and feasts, all named for the god of plenty, or Saturn. During this time, all social order would be turned upside down. Slaves would become masters, and masters, slaves. During this time, lawlessness would often go unpunished, a carnival of disorder. Part of this hedonistic celebration was known as juvenalia, or the legal practice of pedophilia. The upper class would also pay homage to Mithra, god of light, born of a rock. In the later years of the Roman Empire, Mithra would blend with Sol Invictus, god of the unconquered sun. Mithra is often depicted slaying the life-giving bull, whose blood fertilizes the earth's vegetation. In Greek culture, Mithra is known as the Titan, Helios, who drives his chariot driven by 4 winged steeds from east to west daily, guardian of oaths and god of sight.
What they said in the early astronomical traditions is that Saturn was the primeval sun. That's how they described it. And Plato referred to Saturn as Helios, the sun god. Not our sun that we see today, the Saturn sun, referred to as Helios. Now we take Helios to mean our sun because it's the sun god. I say that's a mistake. Actually, they were talking about Saturn. And Diodorus of Sicily, an ancient historian, reported that the Chaldeans in the same area as Sumer, Babylon, now Iraq, called Saturn by the name Helios and said that this was because Saturn was, quote, the most conspicuous of the planets.
Diodorus writes, "To the ones we call Saturn, they give a special name, sun star. The Greek Nonus would call him Kronos, greatest of the Titans. Kronos is depicted with a harp, scythe, or sickle, which he used to castrate Uranus, his father, and overthrow him as god of the sky and ruler of the universe. Kronos, in fear of being overthrown himself, had devoured his children as soon as they were born, apart from Zeus, who was hidden from him and would later overthrow Kronos and imprison him in Tartarus. This would all happen after a great war of the Titans, a war known as Titanomachia. Kronos and his allies would be banished to the lower world, and Zeus would rule. Kronos is also represented holding an hourglass, symbolic, as is the scythe, of fleeting time, Father Time. Ancient Romans believed that Kronos, who they knew as Saturn, took refuge with Janus, king of Italy. A temple is erected to Saturn at the base of Capitoline Hill.
Here's the plan, Sandins. You have until our provisions arrive, provisions which will help us break into your elegant home. If you don't deliver him by the aforementioned time, we'll release the beast on him and on you. And we can enter any home we want, and we will want. Don't force us to hurt you. We don't want to kill our own. Please just let us purge.
The Purge film franchise depicts a near-future world where once a year, for 12 hours, all crime is ignored. During Saturnalia, festivities would last from the 17th to the 25th. Businesses closed, slaves given authority at times. Drunken violence and even ritual sacrifice would fill the streets, similar to the Purge. a perspective that Hollywood has embraced for some time. Temporary kings or royalty would be given power to do as they wish, yet many would be sacrificed to Saturn at the end of a week. The Greeks held a similar festival, known as Chronia. Waxen statuettes were offered to Saturn, and the traditionally bound woolen bands were untied to invite all to join the fun. Human sacrifice, pedophilia, rape, torture, and murder are Saturnalia activities that are often overlooked, and for good reason. An old Roman prophecy called for heads for Hades and phota to Saturn. The traditional greeting for Saturnalia was Lo, Saturnalia, and partiers would yell Lo, Lo, Lo through the streets, possibly the origin for the latter Santa Claus and his iconic Ho, Ho, Ho.
The Bennu bird of Heliopolis was symbolized as Atum Ra. Both symbolized Saturn. And the Bennu bird became the phoenix, which became the eagle, as Freemasonic historians talk about. They worship Saturn as the old sun, the dark lord, and the lord of the rings. Later, Satanism is Saturnism. And it's also symbolized as a eye. Now, what Talbot concluded from reading all these accounts of what happened to Saturn was this, that during these catastrophes, this is a quote from his book, the subject of the global creation legend, the global catastrophe legend, is a spectacular cosmic event actually witnessed by the ancients. Massive quantities of cosmic debris exploded from Saturn, clouding the heavens and eventually congealing into a vast band around the planet. Now, the band is described, like he said, as around the planet. However, what is described is the reflection onto that band of the sun we have today, made it seem from Earth as if there was only part of it, like a beard. And as the day moved on and the sun's angle moved, it's described as appearing that this band went around Saturn, as I'll explain. Now, this is one of Saturn's moons, and I only put this up here because it shows this light behind it. Now, the source of this light is not the same as I'm talking about, but it just gives a feel today, looking at that angle of that Saturn moon, of what it must have looked like in the way they described from Earth. This band, this luminous band. And what they said is, as the sun moved round its angle in relation to Saturn, it appeared from Earth that this was moving around the around Saturn. But that became the main symbol because that appears to be what it looked like for most of the Earth day at that time.
The Romans took these customs and traditions to Britain through a series of invasions, and eventually the festival would be called Festival of Fools, despite the denunciation of various ecclesiastical councils. Along with the Anglo-Saxons of Britain, the Christian Goths of Spain, the Franks in Gaul, Alemannia in Germany, and the Sarmatians of Scythia would all fall to Emperor Constantine. For much of his life, he had worshipped Sol Invictus, but Constantine would later convert to Christianity, becoming the first Roman emperor to do so. Constantine convoked the First Council of Nicaea, which produced the Nicene Creed, erected the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Old Jerusalem after seeing a vision in 312. Constantine was responsible for the Edict of Milan, which ended a nearly 40-year period of persecution of Christians who refused to take the oath to either God or man. In October 1009, Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah ordered the destruction of this church in an extensive campaign against Christian places of worship throughout Palestine and Egypt. This would be a largely unspoken and rarely taught impetus to the first Christian crusades. With Constantine's rule would come the abolition of these pagan practices, or at least an attempt. Over the next few hundred years, it would appear nearly impossible to deny the people of their most beloved yearly festivities, so they began to adopt them. As for the young boys, Holy Innocents' Day, which became an annual festival known as the Feast of the Holy Innocents. One boy would be chosen by his choir children peers to be the bishop for the festival period. A mock mass would be held, and vulgar and obscene songs were sung. Cakes, meats, candies, and even card and dice games were played and consumed at the altar, resembling more of a burlesque show than somber, reflective worship. By the 9th century, some of the church's bizarre and irreverent rituals would be met by angry Protestants. One such perverse ritual was the Feast of the Ass, which included a number of disturbing behaviors, including replacing a donkey that carried Christ into Jerusalem with a wooden mock-up donkey representing the ass of Balaam. Beauvais, Rouen, and Sens held the most notable festivals on Christmas Day, or Christ's Mass. In Beauvais, the celebration was on the 14th of January, and the ass would be led through the streets, being ridden by the prettiest girl in town, holding a baby doll. They would be led to the cathedral and disappear. Instead of the standard rubric for Mass, the congregation would bray like a donkey thrice. In Sens, the Feast of the Ass was similar to the Feast of Fools. After a solemn ceremony, the ass would be led to the town square, where he would become the center of lewd activity for the rest of the night. By 1210, Pope Innocent III did away with the Feast of Innocents altogether and threatened those who disobeyed with excommunication.
Never did pagans solemnize with such extravagance their superstitious festivals, as do they, the lay brothers, the cabbage cutters, those who work in the kitchen, occupy the places of the clergy in the church. They don the sacerdotal garments, reverse side out. They hold in their hands books turned upside down and pretend to read through spectacles, in which for glass have been substituted bits of orange peel.
By the 4th century, the influential government-sanctioned Church of Rome, unable to outlaw the growing number of pagan practices, chose instead to adopt them into their so-called official Christianity. The Church believed this would attract more pagans to their fold.
Up until this time, the birthday of Jesus Christ, the Jewish Messiah, had not been celebrated at all. Ignoring scriptures, however, indicating that the birth probably did not occur during the winter, the Church nevertheless confused biblical history and made Jesus' birthday coincide with the pagan god Mithra. The birth date of the sun god had now become the birth date of the Son of God.
It was hoped that the pagan celebrations of Saturnalia would merge into this new legally sanctioned form of Christianity. The Church's practice of changing the dates of Christian events to coincide with pagan festivals continued, and by the 7th century, Pope Gregory I had ordered Augustine of Canterbury to incorporate any and all pagan practices and customs into the expanding Roman Catholic Church. During the Middle Ages, the debased Mardi Gras atmosphere of what was now known as Christ's Mass had reached a fevered pitch. Common practices included open sex in the streets, rioting, murder, and a number of pagan druidic Halloween rituals. This blood-drenched celebration got so out of hand that by 1652, following the execution of King Charles I, Christ's Mass was finally outlawed in England. A religious reform movement began sweeping the country, led by Puritan Oliver Cromwell. The Puritans took the biblical mandate seriously, which commanded that Christianity remain pure and separate from paganism. Despite their noble efforts, the celebration simply went underground, and by 1656, after only 4 short years under the ban, the public's demand for the legalization of Christ's Mass had become insurmountable.
According to the Cromwell Museum, Cromwell's involvement in the ban was limited, and the story of his ban on decadent mincemeat pies were also untrue. In January of 1642, Parliament would pass a bill legislating for a month of prayer and fasting. But the first Christmas ban came around 1644 because of its occurrence during this fasting period. Due to the Civil War, it was unlikely that much enforcement would be enacted. Presbyterians in Scotland had banned Christmas just a few years earlier. The next year, 1645, Christmas, Easter, and other holidays deemed pagan would no longer be permitted. The ban would be complete and outright by 1647, when Parliament would outlaw Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun celebrations. This led to riots, protests, and of course, excuse for Royalist rebellion. A popular ballad titled "The World Turned Upside Down" would publicly denounce the ban.
Listen to me and you shall hear news have not been this 1,000 year. Heresies have had many more. You never heard them like before. Holidays are despised, fashions are devised. Oh, Christmas is kicked out of town. Yet let's be content and the times are hence. You see the world turned upside down.
The popularity of Christmas would continue to grow over the years and over the seas to America, where the mischief and debauchery were not immediately welcomed either. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of Christmas is the Christmas tree, an evergreen tree symbolizing year-round life and longevity. The evergreen is also one of the oldest symbols, predating Christmas, Saturnalia, and even the birth of Jesus to ancient mystical Babylon.
And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Asher, and built Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth, and Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. The same is a great city. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a city, and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, and they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth.
Nimrod, great-grandson of Noah. His mother, Semiramis, also became his wife. Semiramis was known as Ishtar and Isis. Nimrod was known as Osiris in Egypt. He was founder of the first world order, Babel, or later, Babylon. Semiramis, whose name is Samur Amat in Sumerian, was the Assyrian queen regent, wife and mother of Nimrod. Semiramis was a military strategist, master builder, and had the ability to manipulate her male counterparts. She was instrumental in aiding Nimrod in his conquest to rebel against God. The name Nimrod is likely derived from Hebrew marad or mardut, meaning rebellion. As a Cushite, Nimrod was probably born somewhere in modern Sudan or Ethiopia. Although the Bible does not mention Semiramis by that name, there are stories and legends, some of which appear to be factual, as Semiramis does appear to have existed. Other stories may or may not simply be legend. Diodorus Siculus writes of a King Ninus of Assyria, who has a great city in his name, Nineveh. He was a great hunter-warrior who conquered much of Asia, all the way to India. Hebrew historian Flavius Josephus describes him as a tyrant.
He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence upon his power.
He would erect the Tower of Babel, a tower that would reach the heavens and be tall enough to escape a great flood. Babel was also known as the Ziggurat of Etemenanki, in honor of Marduk, which may have come from Marduk, or Marad, or Nimrod. It's also possible that Nimrod's name comes from the Mesopotamian Ninurta, which is a war god known as the Arrow, the mighty hero. Nimrod encouraged Babylonians not to look at the god of Noah, but to look at the achievements of man. The god of Babylon was Bel, or Baal, meaning Lord. The sun god consort, Ashtoreth, which the Bible does mention, or Ishtar, from where Easter comes. Bel was the chief god of idols, another name being Merodach, which is mentioned in Isaiah 39.
At that time Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he had heard that he had been sick and was recovered.
The name Ninus could possibly be from Assyrian Nunu, meaning fish. Ninus was son of Belus, who was also known as Cronus. Belus comes from Bel, which later became Baal, and later Cronus. After the scattering, Nimrod would continue his reign. According to some Hebrew scholars, Nimrod, like Cronus, lived in fear of being overthrown, or that Shem, another descendant of Noah, would claim his throne. Many of Shem's family were forced to leave the region. The last of the Semitic family would be Terah, but Terah was a follower of Nimrod, even though he had the right to be a ruler, as Nimrod did not. A star would arise in the east, a sign that grew stronger as it grew brighter. Nimrod's magicians and astrologers informed him that a baby would be born that would challenge him. So like in the days of Moses and later Herod, Nimrod ordered all baby boys to be put to death, and it would be Terah charged with the task. A maternity ward was established in the kingdom where baby girls would be birthed and sent home with gifts, while the boys were killed. One night Nimrod's astrologers saw this new star grow even brighter before shooting across the sky and swallowing the other stars in its path. The explanation was that this night a baby would be born, and the unlikely father would be the nearly 130 years old Terah. Terah had hidden the boy in a cave, led to by a secret passage. On the way back, Terah discovered that one of his servants had also birthed a son. This would be the boy Terah would offer to Nimrod, sparing his own son's life in the cave. And according to this legend, this boy would be Abraham, father of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, a crucial biblical figure and link in the chain of prophets from Adam to Muhammad for Muslims. The death of Nimrod is uncertain. As explained in episode 2, One theory is that Nimrod was slain by Israel's brother and rival, Esau, as told in the book of Yashar, which may or may not be the original book of Yashar. The timeline does not appear to be correct, but could explain why Esau would sell his birthright after slaying the king of the world with his men fast approaching. Others argue that there may be about a 600-year gap between the death of Nimrod and Abraham's birth. A more popular idea is that it was Shem who cut Nimrod's life short, along with 72 Egyptian leaders who cut his body to pieces and sent them out to various locations across the earth. This story is similar to the death of Osiris, as Isis reassembles the body and in some accounts impregnates herself with a prosthetic phallus or obelisk that had been missing, enabling her to birth Horus, a story that is key in Freemasonic lore. The disputed book of Yashar tells us a completely different tale of Abraham altogether, but the Bible does not appear to give us an absolute closure on Nimrod's death. Some might even argue that, in a sense, he doesn't die at all, but reappears throughout history as the enemy of the people of Yahweh, until he returns as the Assyrian of Isaiah 14:25.
That I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him underfoot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders.
Despite the variations, one theme remains. Nimrod's rebellion would not be tolerated, sending idolatry underground and paving the way for the need for secret societies, symbolism, and various ways of Saturn, sun, and idol worship would be quietly incorporated, and names would be changed, but the idolatry continues to this day and will until the final hours. What many know as the Sabbath is a reference to Saturn or Saturday, and remnants of cities such as Saturnia, whose hot springs were believed to have been created when an angered Jupiter threw lightning down upon the earth during a battle with Saturn. The bolt opened up a portal to hell. The ancient city of Heliopolis gives direct reference to the old sun of Helios. The cult of the bull sun god, Nevis, was worshipped there, whose horns once again show what appears to be Saturn, then viewed as the sun. This view of Saturn as the sun seems to be shared around the world. Mayans, Incans, Egyptians, Sumerians, Greeks, Indians, Nordics, Latins, all seem to reference a sun that was the central luminary of the sky, but not our sun.
The queen told the worshippers that when Tammuz was killed, some of his blood fell on the stump of an evergreen tree, and the stump grew into a full new tree overnight. This made the evergreen tree sacred by the blood of Tammuz.
Tammuz was the offspring of Nimrod and Semiramis, who was eager to retain power after Nimrod's death. The classic depiction of mother and child likely had its start with Semiramis and Tammuz, or Isis and Osiris. In India, Isi and Iswara. In China, Chiwangmu. In Germany, Nerthus, with the Druids, Virgo Paritura. In many cases, the child is seen as a reincarnation of its father. As explained in episode 2, the worship of Tammuz by Israelites women was condemned. This is clearly depicted in Ezekiel's vision, chapter 8, verse 14.
Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz.
Nimrod was seen as the old stump, and the new evergreen was seen as the newly resurrected Tammuz. This idolatry was a primary cause of Babylon's destruction, and Ezekiel's vision was the prophetic warning. So considering these ideas, is the modern Christian tree, in the home, or even the church, something that is pleasing to God? Is it not blatant disobedience and worship of false gods, the very same that has led to the destruction of even the mightiest of rulers? The Bible appears to be very clear about not only these rituals and the weeping for Tammuz, but also the ramifications for such behavior. Yet the Bible goes even further in regard to the Christmas tree.
Hear ye which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen, with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil. Neither also is it in them to do good. For they also built them high places, and images, and groves, on every high hill, and under every green tree.
Groves is referring to the Hebrew Asherah, meaning to be erect or upright. It was often from a stump representing Nimrod that would be carved and connected with Baal worship and the Kabbalist tree of life. The Bible speaks of cutting down these Asherah poles or trees. Asherah also represents the mother goddess and consort of El, the chief god. El is the Semitic term for God or deity, as in Elohim, Israel, Angel. Semitic civilizations related El to Saturn, the supreme deity represented by a black cube, a representation of Saturn's North Pole, also spoken of in Christmas lore, as the home of Santa, curiously close to Satan. Saturn's North Pole forms a perfect hexagon, with each of its 6 sides close to the projected diameter of the Earth. The cube is a 3-dimensional representation of the 2-dimensional hexagonal North Pole of Saturn. The black cube can be seen almost everywhere, including in the holy city of Mecca, also known as the Hypercube, or known to Muslims as the Kaaba, where Allah is worshipped. Worshippers act as the rings of Saturn by rotating around the cube. When the cube is unfolded, we have the symbol of the Christian cross, another symbol that the Bible never speaks of worshiping. This cube is worn by many Jews over the third eye, called tefillin, and even the number of the beast has a relation to the black sun. The black cube symbolism is all around us, in name and in our art, film culture, and architecture. At the United Nations, there is a curious meditation room with a large black cube in the center. This was donated by the King of Sweden, maintained by the Lucius Trust, which was originally called the Lucifer Trust. The goal of the UN is the same of that of Nimrod, to establish a one-world order. 2,000 years before Christianity, Nimrod was depicted holding a tree and a reindeer, his birthday being celebrated on the 25th of December. Every year, followers went into groves and placed their gifts on a tree to honor Nimrod, and would cut down an evergreen to take into their homes to honor the renewed Tammuz, decorating with silver balls relating to Baal himself. Representing the testicles of the very Tammuz, God's children were not only commanded not to worship, but would be severely punished for. The Christmas tree in many ways is the Asherah pole, adorned with the testicles of Nimrod, and then wrapped with garland, symbolic of the snake, the original serpent, in a forbidden tree. Miles away from Rome, Norse and Germanic tribes were celebrating the solstice with evergreens in the home and burning of the Yule log. Long before Santa Claus, the father of Christmas, was the ruler of the gods, Odin. The names of the week in the English language are named for 6 Germanic gods, and the Roman god Saturn, Wednesday belonging to Odin. The reindeer of Nimrod and Santa are similar to that of Odin's 8-legged horse, Sleipnir. During the midwinter, Odin would conduct his wild hunt across the sky, and children would leave their boots by the fireplace, filled with straw and carrots for Sleipnir. This later evolved into milk and cookies for Santa and his reindeer. Up until the 19th century, Santa himself was also pictured on a horse. Unlike Santa Claus, Odin is missing his left eye, one that he gave at Mimir's well in order to drink from the well of wisdom. Odin portrayed one of 12 characters, each for the month of the year. In December, he was Yule, and the season of his arrival became Yuletide. Odin led his wild band of hunters through the sky, rewarding some, terrifying others. Many of the legends, or sagas, were incredibly dark, such as the ghastly sagas of the Icelanders, written around the 9th to 11th century, or the legends from southeast Europe depicting an underworld race of goblins known as the Kalikantsaroi. For most of the year, Kalikantsaroi spent their time at the center of the earth, attempting to saw down the tree of life that holds up the world. During the 12 days of Christmas, they surface to cause mischief, but sometimes even murder. Simple creatures, the Kalikantsaroi, can only count to 2 and consider the number 3 holy. They will kill themselves before pronouncing it. Another reason to keep the Yule log burning was to prevent them from descending down your chimney. By Epiphany, January 6th, they are frightened away from houses blessed with holy water and a touch of basil. Perhaps it's the Kalikantsaroi that is the original inspiration for Santa's elves. Saint Nick had another curious companion of devilish origin. His name comes from the German Krampen, which means claw. His name, Krampus. Krampus was believed to be the son of the Norse god of the underworld, Hel. As Christianity spread, so did legend of Krampus, despite the effort of the Catholic Church to ban him. While St. Nicholas rewarded the good children, Krampus would beat them with switches and sticks. Sometimes he may even eat them or take them back to hell. During the Krampus run, a drunken parade ensued, with partygoers dressing up and scaring others. Krampus predates Christianity and is believed to be a creature fashioned from the devil himself, hooved and horned. One of the first influential families to adopt traditions involving Krampus was the Habsburg Empire, who had been known to accompany St. Nicholas. Legend of St. Nicholas appears to have parallels with the Osiris and Nimrod legends in the tale of the 3 boys kidnapped in the town of Myra by an evil shopkeeper who cut apart their bodies into pieces and pickled them. St. Nicholas, who heard of the horror, prayed to God, and the boys were raised to life. That evil spirit haunted St. Nicholas for the rest of his life and was called Fouettard. Fouet is French for whip or switch, such as the one Krampus aids Santa with. Black Peter is yet another tale similar to Krampus. The name Saint Nick likely comes from Anglo-Saxon nicken, meaning to murder or slay. During Yuletide season, a child sacrifice was to be offered each night. As Christianity grew in popularity, real sacrifice rituals would be tamed down in gestures such as the eating of little gingerbread men. Even Krampus finds his origins back to Phoenician gods, such as Moloch, another god that requires child sacrifice.
Against whom do ye sport yourselves? Against whom make ye a wide mouth, and draw out the tongue? Are ye not children of transgression? A seed of falsehood, inflaming yourselves with idols under every green tree, slaying the children in the valleys, under the cliffs of the rocks, among the smooth stones of the stream is thy portion. They are thy lot. Even to them hast thou poured a drink offering. Thou hast offered a meat offering. Should I receive comfort in these? Upon a lofty and high mountain hast thou set thy bed. Even thither wentest thou up to offer sacrifice. Behind the doors also, and the post hast thou set up thy remembrance. For thou hast discovered thyself to another than me, and art gone up. Thou hast enlarged thy bed, and made thee a covenant with them. Thou lovest their bed, where thou sawest it.
The horned god of Moloch would have his arms raised by ropes and pulleys. A child would fall from the arms into a pile of burning oak. A gift to Moloch, or Sol Invictus, Saturn.
Silent night, hold.
The story of the Bolshevik Revolution and Holodomor will likely never receive the academic, historic, or cinematic attention the other tragedies in human history might. But between 1916 until the 1940s, Russia and Ukraine would experience the largest slaughter of innocent life in history. From 1756 to 1763, the powers of France, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, and Russia would be embattled with forces from Prussia, Great Britain, and Hanover, and would lead to a series of worldwide conflicts known as the 7 Years' War. Much of this had arisen from an attempt from the Austrian Habsburg dynasty to take the provinces of Silesia, now part of southwest Poland. By the late 1700s, Prussian German refugees by the thousands were looking for a place to settle peacefully, without fear of constant fighting or government interference. Many of these people were of Mennonite or Anabaptist faith. In 1763, Catherine the Great would invite people from all over the world, in particular her home country of Germany, to come and live and work the difficult, expansive, and undeveloped soil, and to teach local Russians their techniques in exchange for 30 hectares of land per family, exemption from military draft, and freedom from religious persecution. Many would settle near the Black Sea, in New Russia, to build homes and independent communities. Most would also decline the assistance of government financial aid. Even though the land was less than ideal, the communities began to thrive and develop, resulting in Catherine's goal of stimulating population growth and use of uncultivated territory. Over the next 5 years, nearly 30,000 people came to Russia, most of them from what is now modern Germany. Religious freedom and the desire to escape religious war was the main reason, and this desire would lead to thriving communities all along southern Russia. With the Napoleonic Wars came another round of settlers, bringing in more farmers, craftsmen, business owners, and prosperity for years to come. But by the year 1894, Tsar Alexander III had fallen ill. His father, Alexander II, was known as Alexander the Liberator, and a radical reformer, relatively popular with the people and supportive of local governance and even limiting some of the privileges of the aristocracy. Alexander had succeeded the throne in February of 1855 at the height of the Crimean War. The war had exposed many of Russia's deficiencies and need to modernize if it were to compete with rapidly developing countries such as England and France, starting by adding thousands of miles of railroad construction, which would improve communication and distribution. Perhaps the most notable and arguably most controversial was the abolition of serfdom, which faced opposition from the aristocracy. But due to the increasing number of peasant revolts, the issue was getting harder to ignore. By 1861, Alexander II issued 17 acts that would free the serfs of the Russian Empire. These uprisings had been going on for years, involving various secret societies such as the People's Will, Narodnaya Volya, a Jewish anti-Tsarist movement that often resorted to violence and terrorism. To this day, many communist parties or movements refer to the people or People's Party to imply the desire of the populace, and yet favor underground terrorism as a means for advancement. These movements would later inspire others in China and the USA. The People's Will was one of the first groups to employ the developing technologies of dynamite to be used as a non-state means of violence. Years later, another group would arise known as the Decembrists, who had drawn its ranks from the aristocracy and former army officers who had served in the Napoleonic Wars. The Decembrists formed around 1816 and had developed to abolish the Tsarist regimes. They rebelled after the death of Alexander I on December 26, 1825, during the winter solstice, hence the name Decembrists. One among them, a Jewish convert by the name of Grigory Peretz, spoke of the need for a Jewish autonomous region in Crimea, or the Orient. This group would adopt the Hebrew term Herut, or freedom, as their motto. Peretz would be arrested and sent into exile. Count Pavel Pastel was one of the Decembrist leaders, who authored the work Russian Justice. In it, he states that the Jews in Russia should not have the rights of citizens, claiming that they are united by an excessive and incomparable solidarity and are unable to become integrated with any nations of the world. Pestel believed that there were two approaches to dealing with the Jews. The first was to destroy the unity among them and to impose a stricter supervision upon them. From 1791 to 1917, Jews had not been able to own land throughout the Pale of Settlement in the western region of the Russian Empire. During the late 19th and early 20th century, the Russian Empire had the majority of the world's Jews living within its borders. After World War I, many would emigrate to the US or turn to Zionism. The Tsarist government wavered back and forth between their support for the Jewish emigration. But by 1890, the Society for the Support of Jewish Farmers and Artisans in Syria and Palestine, otherwise known as the Edessa Committee, formed, holding what they called their first Aliyah to Palestine, then part of the Ottoman Empire. The Jews had a vested interest in overthrowing the Tsarist regime, whose Orthodox Christian stance was firm, as was their dealing with the Jews. In 1897, the General Jewish Labor Bund, a secular Jewish socialist party, was created. Many Jews at the time were members of either the Socialist Revolutionary Party or the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, made up of Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, who were the minority party, which had emerged from a dispute within the party between Menshevik leader Julius Martov and Vladimir Lenin. Martov was a friend and mentor of a young revolutionary by the name of Leon Trotsky. The idea of international proletariat revolution was appealing to Trotsky, born Lev Davidovich Bronstein to a wealthy Ukrainian Jewish family. He would later become instrumental in ending the illustrious Romanov dynasty in violent fashion.
On March 1st, the Emperor traveled to the Mikhailovsky Manege to see the trooping of the color. On his way back, he visited his sister, Grand Duchess Catherine, at Mikhailovsky Castle. They drank tea and talked about his plans to leave for Nice. At 2:10 p.m., the Emperor left in his carriage. He had to be at the Winter Palace by 3 o'clock, as he'd promised to take a walk with his wife. The Emperor's carriage turned onto the embankment along the Catherine Canal. 6 Cossacks accompanied the carriage, 3 on either side. Officers of the guard, including the chief of police, followed in 2 sledges. A boy carrying a bread basket was running along the pavement. Alexander saw a woman make a signal with a white handkerchief. When a man with a packet in his hands appeared before the carriage, he realized there would be an explosion. The 7th attempt on Alexander's life was made by Nicholas Rusakov, a 20-year-old student and member of the People's Will. It was Sofia Perovskaya who had given the signal. Rusakov threw a handmade bomb at the carriage. The blast killed 2 Cossacks and a passing boy, injured 3 horses, and shattered the Emperor's bulletproof coach. But the Emperor was unharmed. Rusakov was quickly apprehended. The chief of police rushed up to Alexander. The Emperor remained calm. I offered him my sledge to go back to the palace. "All right," he said, "but show me the criminal first." Everyone begged the Emperor to leave, but he insisted on seeing Rusakov. Alexander looked his would-be assassin in the eyes. He had survived the 7th attempt. Everything was behind him now. But innocent people had been hurt because of him. Alexander wanted to see the wounded. The chief of police followed. After we'd taken no more than 3 steps, I was deafened by a second explosion. Amid the smoke and fog, I heard His Highness's weak voice cry, "Help!" I tried to lift him, and saw that His Highness's legs were completely shattered. The second bomber was 25-year-old Ignaty Grinovitsky, who blew himself up along with the Emperor. Alexander's last words were, "Hurry home. I want to die in the palace."
Alexander would finally fall to the hands of the people's will, who had already begun assassinating other members of the Russian government. February 23, 1878, a public prosecutor at Kiev is assassinated by a member of the people's will. August 4, 1878, Sergei Kravchinsky stabs Russian Chief of Police General Nikolai Mezensov to death in broad daylight. February 9, 1879, Grigory Goldenberg, a son of a Jewish merchant from Berdichev, assassinates Kharkov Governor General Prince Dmitry Kropotkin. He had also volunteered to kill Alexander II, but the group deemed it unwise for the deed to be performed by a Jew. With the death of Alexander II, the throne would now pass to Alexander III on March 14, 1881. Alexander III would immediately get to work, reversing many of his father's liberal reforms, including canceling the ukaz, which would have led to the creation of a General Assembly. Many of his programs included the Russification of minorities and rejected Western European liberalism. His ideal was to have one nationality, one language, and one religion. That same month, Alexander would sign a supreme decree which led to the expulsion of most Jews from Moscow. At the time, more than half of Moscow's Jewish citizens were involved in trade or banking. This alarmed the Minister of Interior, Count Nikolai Pavlovich Ignatiev, who argued that under Alexander II's reforms, Jews had begun to assume control of the economy and were exploiting the locals. The Jewish community was already under suspicion for their possible involvement of the killing of Alexander II, and under Alexander III's new provisional rules, Jews would see their shops burned and damaged, and riots or pogroms would ensue throughout the Russian Empire. The peasant class largely saw the Jews as unwanted competition, and Alexander himself seemed to believe that the Jewish involvement and domination over commerce was a legitimate source of the enmity toward the Jewish people. The chief procurator of the Holy Synod, Konstantin Popodonostev, had this to say:
The characteristics of the Jewish race are parasitic. For their sustenance, they require the presence of another race as host. Although they remain aloof and self-contained, take them from the living organism, put them on a rock, and they die. They cannot cultivate the soil.
The short reign of Alexander III often receives heavy criticism for his adherence to nationalistic, orthodox ideology introduced by his father, Nicholas I. Yet during this time, Russia would not fight any major wars, dubbing Alexander as the peacemaker, and Russia would see a period of modernization and industrial growth. But by the winter of 1894, Alexander would succumb to nephritis, or inflammation of the kidneys. He was just 49 years old. For all of Alexander's efforts to stabilize the economy for Russian nationals, his portrayal in media and academia is largely focused on his harsh treatment of the Jews. What is not mentioned is the Russian Jews' involvement in helping to create the instability in a relatively short amount of time, largely due to his father's own policies, which he had opposed. Although the newly freed serfs would still struggle to pay off enormous debt for land, it was mostly the aristocracy that revolted against the czars. As is often the case, revolutions said to be for the people, but led by wealthy, well-educated elite. On Wikipedia.com, criticism of Alexander's foreign policy is summed up with a quote from then British Prime Minister Robert Gascoigne Cecil, 3rd Marquess of Salisbury.
It is very difficult to come to any satisfactory conclusion as to the real objects of Russian policy. I am more inclined to believe that there are none, that the emperor is really his own minister, and so bad a minister that no consequent or coherent policy is pursued, but that each influential person, military or civil, snatches from him as opportunity offers the decisions which such a person at the moment wants, and that the mutual effect of these decisions on each other is determined almost exclusively by chance.
Salisbury would relinquish the premiership in 1902 to his nephew, Arthur Balfour.
При этом он считал, что сильное, суверенное, самостоятельное государство должно опираться не только на экономическую и военную мощь, но и на традиции, что великому народу важно сохранять самобытность, а движение вперед невозможно без уважения к своей истории, культуре и духовным ценностям.
The throne would pass to Nicholas, who did not desire the responsibility so early, and it would be he that would become the last of one of the most prolific dynasties in modern history. Nicholas was married to a German princess, Alex of Hesse, and granddaughter of Queen Victoria. They would have 4 girls, Olga, Tatiana, Marie, and Anastasia, and by 1904 had an heir, with the birth of Alexei. But Alexei would soon be diagnosed with hemophilia and was not expected to live long. Along with modernization came the rapid rise of international banking, which allowed banks to become every bit as powerful as monarchies, such as Russia. This banking Goliath would flex its might in 1904 when chairman of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Jacob Schiff, would finance the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, bleeding the Tsar of Capital and earning Schiff awards from Japan, such as the Order of the Sacred Treasure, Order of the Rising Sun, and becoming the first foreigner to receive the Order of the Emperor Meiji. It was because of this financial support that the Japanese would have the edge following the attack against the Russians at Port Arthur, and again the next year, nearly destroying the entire Russian fleet and pride of Catherine the Great, and earning Schiff his first Japanese medal. Schiff convinced enough bankers to withhold their support of Russian war bonds, which would eventually lead to the Four Freedoms Manifesto, the Treaty of Portsmouth, and the eventual end of the Russo-Japanese War. Along with Schiff were Oscar Strauss, who later became Secretary of Commerce, and the first Jewish U.S. cabinet member, Adolf Lewison, investment broker and copper magnate, Adolf Krauss, who later became a Grand Officer of the Jewish Masonic B'nai B'rith, and served as president of the Chicago Board of Education and was personal friends of Presidents Taft and Wilson. The Seligman brothers, Joseph and James of J&W Seligman, investment bankers whose family had grown extremely wealthy, supplying Civil War uniforms to the Union Army, and backed the construction of the Panama Canal. B'nai B'rith and the Jewish Masonic elite would play a major role in the influence of these bankers' decisions. Jacob Schiff would also be acting alongside the wealthy Rothschild family, whose efforts had been less successful in Europe. Schiff and his cohorts made no secret that this financial squeeze was a direct response to the pogroms and restrictions put on Russia's Jewish population. The very same financial manipulation that led to Alexander III's decision to once again expel the Jews would now be used against his son, Tsar Nicholas, and in October of 1905, the Tsar was convinced to grant rights to the Jews to elect and be elected in the proposed National Assembly. The face of Russian government would never be the same.
Peace! We come to see our Tsar! We come in peace! Go back! We come to see our father! Peace! Peace!
Slaughtered like cattle. He didn't come. He never came. Nicholas, the murderer. The bloody, bloody murderer.
January 22nd, 1905. Thousands of working-class citizens, social democrats, peasants, Jews, and Christians marched towards the Winter Palace. The goal? To deliver a petition of reform to Tsar Nicholas II. According to most history books, the following events retell of the Cossacks attacking the crowd with cannon fire and drawn swords, a massacre of innocent lives, and the nail in the coffin for the credibility of the Tsar. This event would become known as Bloody Sunday, and it was a pivotal moment in what would lead to Russia's eventual revolution a few years later. It's estimated that there were nearly 150,000 protesters that day, mostly peaceful, working-class people that would have no idea what they were marching into. While the Tsar's officials stated 96 lives would be lost, anti-Tsarists estimate nearly 4,000. So how could there be such a discrepancy? As usual, most history books leave out some crucial details, starting with the leader of the movement, Orthodox priest Georgy Gapon, who survived the event and would take refuge in the home of author Maxim Gorky. Gorky himself would later be arrested on charges of arranging a coup. Gapon was a son of a Cossack and considered an avid follower of writer Leo Tolstoy, and not known as an anti-Tsarist, but was a recipient of financial support from the Japanese army. Did Gapon unwittingly lead his people to the palace for a peaceful demonstration, or is there more to the story? From the video titled Sunday, January 9th, the old-style date for January 22nd, 1905, which is part of a project for the book The Romanov Royal Martyrs, authored by the Fathers of Mesopotamos Monastery.
First of all, it must be known that Father Georgy Gapon was not the good and kindly father of the downtrodden workers that history portrays, but rather he played a curious double game. He was an agent of the Okhrana, namely of the secret police, while at the same time cooperating with the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Thus, Gapon's dark role and the true motives of all his actions are not at all easy to discern. At first, Gapon presented himself as a champion of the Tsarist constitution, and so the Okhrana indicated that it wished to utilize his charismatic influence on the masses of workers with a view to safeguarding the monarchical constitution in Russia. Later, however, Gapon appeared to reconsider his ideology and then began to cooperate with the extreme left, which in turn wished to use Gapon for the promotion of its own revolutionary ideas among the workers. When Gapon officially announced the organization of the march, which he scheduled for the 9th of January, the police warned him that such a thing would constitute an illegal demonstration, for the dispersal of which, if necessary, force would be used. Furthermore, they informed him that the Tsar would not be at the Winter Palace at that time, thus it would be impossible to accomplish the demonstrators' purpose of handing over their demands to Nicholas in person. In the end, Gapon did not comply with the police's instructions. the march took place as planned. Perhaps Gapon did not believe that the authorities would disperse his peaceful march. He himself answered this question later when he admitted that he knew full well that the authorities would not permit the protest to take place under any circumstances, because, very simply, it would not have been peaceful. The chief of the Special Corps of the Tsar's secret personal guard, and afterward historian, Alexander Spiridovich, wrote of this. Nobody had the idea then at the time, that is, on the 9th of January 1905, that Gapon had played the role of traitor. It was some long time later that Gapon admitted that he had known, in inciting the workers to go before the Tsar with their petition, that the authorities would never permit the demonstration. He also knew that they would bring in the troops against the workers, and all the same he still urged them to demonstrate, and in fact insisted they do so. A great number of workers were members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, and even though the party did not officially take part in the demonstration, many of their members participated in the march. A multitude of witnesses relate that many of the demonstrators were armed. They broke windows, they looted stores, they burnt vehicles, and even broke into houses. Thus, the shots of the security forces were not in cold blood, but in reply to the repeated provocations of the demonstrators. A highly confidential note by the head of the Petersburg Security Department, L.N. Kremenetsky, to the director of the police department, A.A. Lopukhin, on the preparation of workers for the demonstration of the 8th of January, reports the following. Top secret. According to the information obtained for tomorrow, at the initiative of Father Gapon, the revolutionary organizations of the capital also intend to use the march of the striking workers to the Palace Square to produce an anti-government demonstration. For this purpose, flags with criminal inscriptions are made today, and these flags will be hidden until the police act against the march of the workers. Then, taking advantage of the confusion, the flag bearers will take out the flags to create an impression that the workers marched under the flags of revolutionary organizations. Then, the socialist revolutionaries intend to take advantage of the disorder in order to plunder the weapons shops along Bolshaya Konyushnya Street and Liteyny Prospekt. Reporting on Your Excellency, I add the possible measures for the removal of flags have been taken. Lieutenant Colonel Kremenetsky, January 8th, 1905. As for the fact that some of the demonstrators held icons, church banners, and portraits of the Tsar, that can also be explained. A certain portion of the workers did not realize what was about to happen. They believed Gapon's fraudulent promises and did not know that the Tsar was absent from the palace that day. These were the first to be surprised by the violent behavior of the other demonstrators. They indeed had peaceful intentions and believed that they would meet the Tsar to hand over to him their humble petition. They also did not know that the content of the petition almost did not have anything to do with them at all.
That manifesto would be written by Pinchas Rutenberg, a Russian Jewish engineer, an activist, and one of the founders in what would later become the American Jewish Congress, a vocal Zionist and member of the Russian Duma, or Assembly, whose very existence was a direct result of the Bloody Sunday events. Rutenberg quickly befriended Gapon days before the 22nd, and the two were nearly inseparable the entire time. Rutenberg had planned the direction of the march and had instructed protesters to set up barricades in case police attacked, which suggests that this peaceful protest was likely anything but. The damaged shops and stores that would occur along the way and in the days preceding would never serve to benefit the shop and store keepers, and yet it would be many unaware shop and store keepers that would lose their life that day. A literal false flag. Gapon and Rutenberg would eventually flee Russia and left for Switzerland, where they would collaborate with Lenin. Rutenberg would be able to maneuver thanks to the financial aid of Edmund James de Rothschild and son James A. de Rothschild. Rutenberg would eventually settle in Palestine and aid propositions for the Treaty of Versailles, which would bring an end to the First World War. Gapon revealed his secret police contacts to Rutenberg, who then reported Gapon to his party leader, Yevno Azef and Boris Savinkov. On the 26th of March, 1906, Gapon met Rutenberg in a cottage near St. Petersburg. He would not be seen again for a month, until he was found at the very cottage, hanged.
On the 14th of January 1905, Alexandra wrote to her sister Victoria, "You understand the crisis we're going through. It is a time full of trials indeed. Reforms can only be made gently with the greatest care and forethought. Things are in a bad state, and it's abominably unpatriotic at the time when we are plunged into war to break forth with revolutionary ideas. The poor workmen who had been utterly misled had to suffer, and the organisers have hidden as usual behind them. Don't believe all the horrors the foreign papers say. They make one's hair stand on end. Foul exaggeration." The petition had only 2 questions concerning the workmen, and all the rest was atrocious. Had a small deputation brought calmly a real petition for the workmen's good, all would have been otherwise. Many of the workmen were in despair when they heard later what the petition contained, and begged to work again under the protection of the troops.
The events that would soon take place would change the world, and yet many are still unaware that it ever happened at all.
Называется распространение вражды к евреям. Когда проклятая царская монархия доживала свое последнее время, она старалась натравить темных рабочих и крестьян на евреев. Царская полиция в союзе с помещиками и капиталистами устраивала еврейские погромы. Ненависть измученных нуждой рабочих и крестьян помещики и капиталисты старались направить на евреев. И в других странах приходится видеть нередко, что капиталисты разжигают вражду к евреям, чтобы засорить глаза рабочих, чтобы отвлечь их взоры от настоящего врага трудящихся, от капитала. Вражда к евреям держится прочно только там, где кабала помещиков и капиталистов создала беспросветную темноту рабочих и крестьян. Только совсем темные, совсем забитые люди могут верить лжи и клевете, распространяемой против евреев. Это остатки старого, крепостного времени, когда попы заставляли сжигать еретиков на кострах, когда существовало рабство крестьян, когда народ был задавлен и безгласен. Эта старая крепостническая темнота проходит. Народ становится зрячим. Не евреи враги трудящих, враги рабочих, капиталисты всех стран. Среди евреев есть рабочие, труженики, их большинство. Они наши братья по угнетению капиталов, наши товарищи по борьбе за социализм. Среди евреев есть кулаки, эксплуататоры, капиталисты, как и среди русских, так и среди всех наций. Капиталисты стараются посеять и раздеть вражду между рабочими разной веры, разной нации, разной расы. На родине рабочих держится сила и власть капитала. Богатые евреи, как и богатые русские, как и богачи всех стран, в союзе друг с другом давят, гнетут, грабят, разъединяют рабочих. Позор проклятому царизму, мучившему и преследовавшему евреев. Позор тем, кто сеет вражду к евреям, кто сеет ненависть к другим нациям. Да здравствует братское доверие и боевой союз рабочих всех наций в борьбе за свержение капитала.
March 1917. The Russian Empire is swarmed with revolution and acts of violence. Ukrainians are also making an attempt at revolution, and once again, the city of Kiev will serve as a seat of government. Nearly 90,000 exiles, Jews, criminals, Freemasons, would return to Russia, many changing their names to hide their Jewish identity. Trotsky was now issued papers to travel to Russia, and although there would be no concrete evidence that this trip would be directly funded by bankers such as Jacob Schiff and Max Warburg, the benefactor was from New York. From The Creature from Jekyll Island, American author G. Edward Griffin stated that Schiff was one of the principal backers of the Bolshevik Revolution and personally financed Trotsky's trip from New York to Russia. This would later appear to be true, according to an admission by Schiff's own grandson that Trotsky had been given $20 million in gold, worth billions today. This was all in exchange for the triumph of communism in Russia. Schiff's money and influence would also become instrumental in supporting American President Woodrow Wilson and the passing of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Warburg was a German Jew who had little love for Germany. Max was already suspected in numerous conspiracies suggesting he had helped cause the First World War and tried to destroy Germany. Professor Anthony Sutton suggests that President Wilson was the fairy godmother who provided Trotsky with a return passport to Russia. With it came a Russian entry permit, a British transit visa, and $10,000 in cash. He was stopped by Canadian officials in Nova Scotia, but later released. That event is documented by Canadian intelligence officer Lieutenant Colonel John McLean, who pens the article, "Why Did We Let Trotsky Go?" McLean points out that whoever intervened on Trotsky's behalf was acting upon request from the U.S. State Department by way of the British Embassy in Washington. That person in charge would have been Lord Arthur Balfour, Prime Minister of the UK, nephew of the 3rd Marquess of Salisbury, member of the Cecil family, and issuer of the Balfour Declaration, establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Getting back to the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the ironies of it is that both Lenin and Trotsky were in exile, one in Germany, one in the United States. Tell us about who helped them get where they were going to make sure that revolution was pulled off.
Well, let me summarize about 4 chapters into 4 minutes. Trotsky was in New York. He had no income. I summed his income for the year he was in New York. It was about $600. Yet he lived in an apartment. He had a chauffeured limousine. He had a refrigerator, which was very rare in those days. He left New York and went to Canada on his way to the revolution. He had $10,000 in gold on him. He didn't earn more than $600 in New York. He was financed out of New York. There's no question about that. The British took him off the ship in Halifax, Canada. I got the Canadian archives. They knew who he was. They knew who Trotsky was. They knew he was going to start a revolution in Russia. Instructions from London came to put Trotsky back on the boat with his party and allow them to go forward. So there is no question that Woodrow Wilson, who issued the passport for Trotsky, and the New York financiers who financed Trotsky, and the British Foreign Office allowed Trotsky to perform his part in the revolution. Now over in Switzerland you get Lenin, who was in exile. He went through Germany in the famous sealed train by permission and with the encouragement of the German General Staff. And yet Germany and Britain were supposedly fighting each other. And you get them both moving these two key revolutionaries into place inside Russia. And then, of course, the rest is history. They created a revolution with no more than about 10,000 revolutionaries. They needed assistance from the West, and they got assistance from Germany, from Britain, and from the United States to continue and consolidate the revolution.
Just tell us all over again why.
Why?
Just tell
you
it
won't find
again.
this in the textbooks. Why is to bring about, I suspect, a plan to control world society in which you and I won't find the freedoms to believe and think and do as we believe.
Did these power brokers actually envision at that time a one-world government that would be socialist?
Yes. The second statement I made was that they did not want the Soviet Union to develop into another free enterprise society, and that this would offset it. Aiding the revolution would offset this event. That was made as a statement in 1919. You have various books, one by Gillette, the razor blade Gillette, called The City, I think it was, which laid out this corporate socialism for the world to see as early as, 1905, 1910. So around the turn of the century, you begin to see actually written statements by these internationalist businessmen of the kind of socialist empire they wanted to bring about. It's there, but these books, of course, are not included in your courses in political science and history at the regular universities.
Tsar Nicholas and his opposition to international banking, along with the fact that Russia possessed large oil fields, would mean that Russia would be a high-value target for communist revolt. These same entities were already setting their sights in the New World. The Russian media had long painted the Tsarina as a German spy, and the Tsar as a cold-blooded killer, insouciant to the bloodbath that occurred during the Bloody Sunday events. There were reports of agents handing money to troops and state officials, encouraging mutiny, including accounts of the famed Preobrazhensky, Volensky, and Pavlovsky regiments marching down the street without a single officer. The State Department acknowledged large denominations of ruble notes given to the members of Pavlovsky's regiment just hours before they would mutiny. March 15, 1917. Tsar Nicholas is returning home from visiting the troops when revolutionaries block his path. This would be the last time Nicholas would depart the train, as he would abdicate the throne. Nicholas still had the support of former officers, noblemen, and various loyalists who were wise to the goals of the Bolsheviks and created the White Russian Army. This would be their battle for the Christian soul of Russia. The Bolsheviks ransacked the royal palace and transferred the Romanovs to Ekaterinburg, the family now under the responsibility of Yakov Sverdlov and Yakov Yurovsky. They eventually received orders from Lenin, who appears to have gotten his instructions in a letter from Jacob Schiff to eliminate the entire royal family bloodline. Even the cousin of Nicholas, King George V, was unable to save Nicholas and his family. A plan to rescue the Romanovs had been staged, but abandoned at the last moment, leaving many to wonder if George had also been threatened with a similar revolt. The Romanov family would be subjected to a cruel treatment over their last few weeks, and Alexei's hemophilia would slowly begin to kill him. July 17th. Yurovsky orders the Romanovs to wake up at 1:30 a.m. The family is led to a small basement where they are told they would be posing for a portrait. The family and company of 11 would be met by 11 armed men. Yurovsky later testified that he shot Nicholas point blank. He would be the only one to die quickly. An intoxicated Peter Ermakov shot and killed Alexandra, and then shot at Maria, hitting her in the leg. The entire scene would erupt into violent chaos. and Yurovsky would be forced to stop because of the overwhelming smoke from the gunpowder. When the smoke cleared, it was apparent that the Romanov children were still alive. An entire round was used on Alexei, who was sitting. The children had to be shot multiple times, and in the head, as all of them had diamonds and gems sewn into their clothing to protect from gunfire. It would be a messy, drawn-out, violent massacre. And even Yurovsky would later admit to executioner Nikolin's poor mastery of his weapon and inevitable nerves. Nearly 70 bullets fired, and multiple sloppy bayonet wounds. Only Alexei's dog, Joy, survived. According to Ermakov, Nicholas's last words were, "You know not what you do." The Bolsheviks nationalized all confiscated items from the Romanovs, their bodies loaded onto a truck and disposed in a mine shaft, but not before Ermakov's men would have their way with the corpses. To this day, it is contended that the Romanov family was killed in ritualistic fashion, a claim that is only met with counterclaims of anti-Semitism. The barbaric, incompetent, callous, and horrific manner in which the Bolsheviks carried out this heinous act is rarely taught in universities, likely because most universities still champion these ideas that are not revolutionary at all, but always lead to bloodshed and despair, and in this case, the end of the storied Romanov dynasty.
I do not believe that everything that is now going on in Russia is due to the Russian people. The labor strikes are organized by the Polish and Jewish engineers. The world accuses us of making pogroms, but I believe that the pogroms are a natural appearance. The Jews wish to dominate over Russia and over the Tsars. We defend ourselves.
The German farming kulak community that Catherine the Great had invited so long ago to help develop the land and increase productivity would now be under threat. The Tsar would no longer be able to protect the kulaks from this new form of government, and kulaks would not only be eligible for draft, but often forced into labor, service, or death. The entire region of Russia and Ukraine would descend into chaos. Out of the instability, other anarchist movements would develop, arguably none bigger than that of Nestor Makhno, a Ukrainian peasant who despised the bourgeois despite politics. Makhno robbed and pillaged kulak communities, spreading even more terror in what had long been peaceful communities. As a boy, Nestor worked on the Mennonite Kroger clockmaker plant, and the Mennonite community would be a target of much of Makhno's retribution. It would be Makhno that would finally require the long pacifist Mennonites to learn to defend themselves. Nestor was not particularly fond of the Bolsheviks, but would eventually align his Black Army with the Red Army to defeat the White Russians, although it appears that he went back and forth numerous times. Makhno was not a revolutionary, he was an anarchist, and although the Bolsheviks would appeal to Makhno for aid, he also knew they wanted to eliminate him, and so once again, the idea of anti-Semitism would be the killing blow for Nestor Makhno. The Bolsheviks spread propaganda that Makhno was a pogromщик and that his Black Army persecuted Jews, a fact that wasn't particularly true. Nevertheless, the Bolsheviks would employ this method to destabilize his authority and popularity amongst the peasants. The kulak farmers, however, would struggle. Stuck between the conflict, their only option appeared to be to develop a self-defense strategy. In just 3 days, over 280 Mennonite women and children were violently hacked and beaten to death between November 29 and December 1st, 1919. In the town of Münsterberg, only one of 30 farms had survived being burnt to the ground, only to be destroyed by neighbors. This account is recalled in Dietrich Neufeld's collection of documents entitled A Russian Dance of Death, Revolution and Civil War in the Ukraine.
We feel as if we've been condemned to death and are now simply waiting for the executioner to come. Those who are not sunk in apathy are thinking of escape. But we have been notified that anyone caught 3 steps from his house will be shot without warning. Actually, there are so many armed riders around that any attempt to escape would mean certain death. Besides, there are families to consider. And where could one go?
With the land being nationalized, many Russians would now be clinging or fighting to any land they could find. Since the emancipation of the serfs, land would be the main desire of the peasants, although the Bolsheviks would argue that it was greed, it was survival, and survival of the fittest. Ukrainian peasants would often be forced to travel nearly 10 miles to get to their land plots, while passing the well-developed Mennonite land, which they had worked for years. This led to chaotic infighting and hatred between the largely German Mennonites and the Ukrainians. Makhno would fight the Bolsheviks would take Ukraine, and many Mennonites not devastated by war, famine, or typhus would leave Russia by the thousands. Between 1917 and 1923, nearly 1,230 Mennonites murdered. By 1921, what was still left of Makhno's men left for Romania. Makhno died in Paris in 1934.
100 тисяч, мільйон, 4, 7, 10 і навіть 15 мільйонів загиблих. Жертви голоду стали політичним інструментом. Одні цілеспрямовано їх занижують, а інші завищують. Скільки ж насправді загинуло від голодомору і чи був він штучний? Липень 41-го року. Німецькі війська стрімко наступають. Радянська влада знищує у київських архівах статистику населення України в період голоду. Не безпідставно. Вже незабаром в окупованому німцями Харкові український агроном-економіст Степан Сосновий підраховує кількість жертв голодомору. Сосновий перший, хто зробить це науково, на основі статистики, але без важливих даних, які знищили. Однак, як виявиться, вони збереглися в Москві, точніше, їхня копія. 5 років тому українські вчені з Інституту демографії та соціальних досліджень імені Птухи скопіювали і привезли ці документи до України. Саме вони разом із американськими дослідниками вперше зробили повномасштабне дослідження демографічних втрат від голодомору. Вони стверджують, їхні підрахунки наукові, а не політичні. Щоб зробити це, вчені на основі віднайдених архівних документів реконструювали статистику народжуваності і смертності населення України між 1927 і 1939 роками. З даних прибрали фальсифікації радянської влади. Потім від всіх померлих у роки голодомору відняли тих, хто помер би і так своєю смертю. Вчені виявили. Через надсмертність від голодомору у 1932 році загинули 250 тисяч людей. У 1934-му, коли всі думали, що голод закінчився, 160 тисяч. А у 1933-му їх було в десятки разів більше. – 3 мільйони 530 тисяч. Також через голод не народилося ще близько 600 тисяч. Тобто загалом від голодомору Україна втратила близько 4,5 мільйонів людей. Практично всі загиблі – селяни. Ці цифри вражають, адже навіть під час жорстокої німецької окупації смертність на селі буде втричі меншою. Але чому така велика смертність? Жахливі погодні умови? Однак голод через посухи та неврожай траплявся в Україні і раніше. Але ніколи не гинуло стільки людей. І це перше, що свідчитиме про штучність голодомору. Тоді більшість померла у 1933 році, точніше лише впродовж 6 місяців. Найбільш смертоносним став червень. Так масово і швидко від природного голоду не гинули ніде й ніколи у світі. І це свідчить, у селян забирали не лише пшеницю. На фото одна із 1000 бригад, яка й займалась цим. В їхніх руках металеві штики, щупи. Ними радянські активісти шукали у землі заховане зерно, а на практиці всю знайдену їжу. Ось як цю кукурудзу.
Typhus would ravage these communities, infecting nearly 95% of the population. Over 1 million would die over the next few years. The death toll would climb, but little would be said overseas in the media about the atrocities occurring. Many international interests were being served by the Bolshevik Revolution, and their media lackeys would do little to stop them. It seems that many Americans would also benefit from these tragedies, including Charles Richard Crane, organizer of the Westinghouse Company in Russia, former chairman of the Democratic Party's Finance Committee, major backer of Woodrow Wilson's campaign, and part of the infamous Jekyll Island Millionaires Club. He had made nearly 30 trips to Russia. According to former German ambassador William Dodd, Crane did much to bring on the Kerensky Revolution, which gave way to communism. Even though Crane was a civilian, he received reports and cables regarding the progress of the Bolsheviks. This was pointed out in cable messages to the U.S. by the U.S. consul Madden Summers, who would later mysteriously turn up dead at the age of 40. The official cause was reported in the New York Times as overwork. Crane's support for the Bolsheviks and communism may not have reflected in his overall feelings for the Jews. In a letter to William Dodd, Crane stated,
"The Jews, after winning the war, galloping along at a swift pace, getting Russia, England, and Palestine, being caught in the act of trying to seize Germany too, and meeting their first real rebuff, have gone plumb crazy and are deluging the world, particularly easy America, with anti-German propaganda. I strongly advise you to resist every social invitation."
In 1920, Woodrow Wilson would appoint Crane to a new position where he could impose his communist leanings as U.S. ambassador to China. 1911, the St. Louis Dispatch publishes a cartoon by the Bolshevik Robert Minor. It portrays Karl Marx holding a book entitled Socialism, surrounded by admirers John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, John D. Ryan, George Perkins, and Teddy Roosevelt. The cartoon, entitled Delighted, illustrated the financial and political powers bankrolling for socialism, Bolshevism, and communism, while appearing to be capitalist. Minor was arrested in Tsarist Russia before the revolution began, and it was revealed that he was bankrolled by the same financiers.
The Germans knew what they were doing when they sent Lenin's pack of Jews into Russia. They chose them as agents of destruction. Why? Because the Jews were not Russians, and to them the destruction of Russia was all in the way of business, revolutionary and financial. The whole record of Bolshevism in Russia is indelibly impressed with the stamp of alien invasion. The murder of the Tsar, deliberately planned by the Jew Sverdlov, who came to Russia as a paid agent of Germany, and carried out by the Jews Golozhikin, Siromolotov, Safarov, Voikov, and Yukovsky, is the act not of the Russian people, but of this hostile invader.
The revolution in Russia was not only a Jewish movement, but a Freemasonic one. Most of the organizers were involved with a secret society of some sort. To oppose or even announce this idea was met with accusations of anti-Semitism. Yet apart from Lenin and a few others, nearly the entire structure of the Bolshevik movement was Jewish, a fact well known then, but nearly always ignored now. It was Trotsky himself who would coin the phrase racism. The first recorded use of this term was used in this document from 1930, entitled The History of the Russian Revolution. The paragraph translates as such:
Slavophilism, the messianism of backwardness, has based its philosophy upon the assumption that the Russian people and their church are democratic through and through, whereas official Russia is a German bureaucracy imposed upon them by Peter the Great. Mark remarked upon this theme. In the same way the Teutonic jackasses blamed the despotism of Frederick II upon the French, as though backward slaves were not always in need of civilized slaves to train them. This brief comment completely finishes off not only the old philosophy of the Slavophiles, but also the latest revelations of the racists.
The Slavophiles referred to were Slavic nationalists and traditionalists, an idea Trotsky despised. In fact, communism and Judaism, as well as Freemasonry, are essentially based on the same ideals and rituals.
With the notable exception of Lenin, the majority of leading figures are Jews. Moreover, the principal inspiration and the driving power comes from Jewish leaders. There is much in the fact of Bolshevism itself, in the fact that so many Jews are Bolshevists, in the fact that the ideals of Bolshevism at many points are consonant with the finest ideals of Judaism. It seems only the public figureheads of Bolshevism are occasionally non-Jewish. Russians argue that because the funding for the revolution came from Jewish sources, the underlying Marxist philosophy derives from Jewish thinkers. The instigators on the ground and the leadership of the party and the Cheka secret police are almost entirely composed of Jews, and the only state-protected ethnic group is now the Jews, with anti-Semitism an offense punishable by death, while Christians seem to be the targets of all manners of aggression and atrocity. That this battle seems to be one of race or culture, and not at all a class war scenario championed by the press. Jews predominant in local social government, anti-Jewish feeling growing among population.
The new Bolshevik regime sealed off borders and confiscated food from the peasants. Anyone protesting this could be shot. Starving citizens would be shot for picking up even a stalk of wheat from the fields. Starvation would reach epidemic proportions, killing 7 million in Ukraine alone. Nearly 3 million were children. In less than 2 years, over 10 million dead. The grain being grown was confiscated and taken to mills and silos, and much of it sold off to Western nations, while the peasants starved, and little to no reporting of the millions that were dying. Outraged Germans made numerous attempts to send aid, but were turned away. It was the Red Cross who were blockading crucial aid, food, and medical items, while claiming there was no famine at all.
Talk about the Red Cross mission.
Red Cross mission to Russia, 1918.
About 17 bankers, lawyers, businessmen.
Well, yes,
a couple of doctors.
There were 2 doctors, I think. There were 2 doctors.
What was the mission?
The mission was financed by William Boyce Thompson, the Chase Manhattan Bank, Federal Reserve System. The Red Cross didn't want to send a mission. The Red Cross said, we don't need a mission to Russia. They already had one in Romania, which was doing a good job. But William Boyce Thompson wanted this mission, and he put the money up. He financed it. And if you look, I printed a list of the people on the mission, and they were mostly bankers and lawyers, Wall Street lawyers, and people in and around the Wall Street establishment. The function or the purpose of this mission was to be in place to assist the Bolshevik Revolution. The Red Cross mission to Russia was a cover vehicle. It enabled these Wall Street elitists, these Wall Street manipulators to be there in place. And then I traced a cable, $1 million from the Morgan Company in New York to Petrograd. I forget to which bank, but it came from William Boyce Thompson, and which financed the revolution. And then they put pressure back in the State Department in Washington to actually send arms to the revolution, which went forward in 1918. And then I found in the State Department files an extraordinary telegram in which Trotsky appealed to the State Department to send American Army instructors to train the new Soviet Army. And I think I reprinted that in one of my earlier books. So briefly, the Red Cross mission was a cover vehicle to enable Wall Street to be there in place to guide and manipulate the ongoing Bolshevik Revolution.
Much of this grain simply rotted. As the famine worsened, livestock, domestic animals, and eventually, even children began to go missing. The obvious question of cannibalism was prohibited from discussion by the government, and propaganda videos were displayed for the world to see. But some did dare to report on such events, like Gareth Jones, who went despite the travel ban and lectured about his findings in London and Berlin. He revealed that the famine had grown worse and had scathing criticism of the Bolsheviks.
Повернувшись у Берлін 29 березня 1933 року, Гарет Джонс поширює прес-реліз, у якому детально описує побачене в Україні.
I tramped through the Black Earth region because that was once the richest farmland in Russia, and because the correspondents have been forbidden to go there to see for themselves what is happening.
Одночасно Гарет пише листа своєму патрону Ллойд Джорджу.
The situation is so grave, so much worse than in 1921, that I am amazed at your admiration for Stalin. Yours sincerely, Gareth Jones.
Ми не знаємо, що відповів Ллойд Джордж Гарету, і чи відповів взагалі. Відомо лише, що статті Джонса про голод в Україні не мали особливого резонансу ні в громадській думці, ані в політичних колах. Європа готувалась до Великодніх свят. Британський істеблішмент прислухався до інших експертів, таких як Бернард Шоу, а вони розповідали зовсім іншу історію. Америка теж не почула Гарета. Країна щойно отямилась від потрясінь Великої депресії і слухала, що скаже їй новий президент.
Preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
Moscou, le 26 décembre 1933. À Monsieur Max Hubert, président du Comité international de la Croix-Rouge, Genève. Toutes les informations de la presse étrangère concernant la situation difficile de la République soviétique ukrainienne et de la région du Caucase du Nord en ce qui concerne les problèmes d'alimentation ne sont qu'une campagne de calomnie préméditée, entreprise par des organisations hostiles des groupements des Russes émigrés blancs. Il est tout naturel que le comité exécutif renonce à tout échange de lettres avec le comité international de la Croix-Rouge en ce qui concerne la substance de cette campagne de calomnie. Pavel Yanukidze, président du comité exécutif de l'Alliance des sociétés de la Croix et du Croissant Rouge de l'URSS.
Konstantin Ulmansky from the Soviet press office encouraged reporters to denounce Jones, and reporters such as Louis Fisher would do just that. A member of the Jewish Legion, contributor for The Progressive and the New York Evening Post, Fisher would report that he had not witnessed any starvation, countering Jones, and even going as far as to say the food shortage was the fault of the Ukrainian nationalists. But it was New York Times reporter Walter Duranty who would sell this lie to the masses, saying, "There is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation." Jones died on the eve of his 30th birthday, murdered by Chinese soldiers in Inner Mongolia. Some of the few reporters brave enough to travel and report the truth would discover that Umansky, Fisher, and Duranty were all funded by the same sources who funded the revolution, and would be met with charges of anti-Semitism or would struggle to publish their work. Even Lenin would say that the famine creates a proletariat. It was not just a famine, it was a genocide. Church bells would be toppled as part of the Bolsheviks' anti-religious campaigns. By the 1930s, the church bells were silenced, most of them destroyed. A few were sold off, such as the Danilov bells, which were on display at Harvard University until they were returned to Russia in 2008. Many young Russian Boy Scouts had been recruited for the Tsarist White Army, and the Red Army's Youth Brigade, or Komsomol, would emerge. These youth would be the ones to spy on their neighbors and carry out the policies of Lenin, and later Stalin, who arose to power by committing robberies and kidnapping for Lenin's Bolsheviks. On Orthodox Christmas Eve, January 6, 1923, the Komsomol Christmas Festival was held in the new capital. a parade with lewd and obscene dancers and floats with the purpose of mocking religion, a figure of God embracing a naked woman. Christmas trees with red stars would adorn the streets. Mock trials judging Christianity were staged, equally as obscene. The parade ended with images of Buddha, Christ, Muhammad, and Osiris, all being burned. Young activists would confront and provoke Christian believers, essentially wassailing. Burnt effigies of Moses and Jehovah, anti-religious theater, and celebration of the gods of old.
In the early 1960s, Solzhenitsyn published a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was a story about one day in the life, his life really, inside one of these so-called Gulag archipelago camps. Now, he called it the Gulag archipelago because an archipelago is a chain of islands. And so Solzhenitsyn likened the work camp system in the Soviet Union, which was made up of isolated camps distributed across the entire state. He likened that to a series of islands, and hence the metaphor. And One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was one of the first publications released in the Soviet Union that dared make public what had happened inside these camps, at least initially. Now, that thaw didn't last very long, but that book had a tremendous effect. It's a short book, it's worth reading. The first one details the origin of the oppressive Soviet system, at least in part under Lenin, and then its full-fledged implementation under Stalin, and the deaths of, well, Solzhenitsyn estimated the deaths in internal repression in the Soviet Union at something approximating 60 million between 1919 and 1959. Now, that doesn't count the death toll in the Second World War, by the way. Now, people have disputed those figures, but they're certainly in the tens of millions, and the low-end bounds are probably 20 million, and the high-end bounds are nearer what Solzhenitsyn estimated. He also estimated that the same kind of internal repression in Maoist China cost 100 million lives, and so you can imagine that the genuine historical figures, again, are subject to dispute, but somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. And one of the things that's really surprising to me, and that I think is absolutely reprehensible, is the fact that this is not widespread knowledge among students in the West, any of this, and it's because your education, your historical education, if you started to describe it as appalling, you would barely scratch the surface. These were the most important events of the 20th century, and they're barely covered at all in standard historical curricula. You know of something, I would presume, about World War II and about the terrible situation in Nazi Germany and the death of 6 million gypsies and Jews and homosexuals in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But my experience with students has been that none of them know anything about what happened as a consequence of the repression of the radical left in the 20th century. And I believe the reason for that is that the communist system had extensive networks of admirers in the West, especially among intellectuals, and still in fact does, which is also equally reprehensible. And I believe that one of the consequences of that is that this element of history has been under-examined, and certainly very little attention has been brought to it in the public school curricula, and there's absolutely no excuse for that. It was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. And that's really saying something, because the 20th century was about as bad as it gets. And so, and the fact that these deaths on massive scale occurred, and the fact that we don't know that deep inside our bones is a testament to the absolute rot of the education system.
סיפורים חשובים, עובדות חשובות, שמעבירות דברים שלא קיבלנו בבית הספר. לא קיבלנו בתוכנית הלימודים, כשם שלא לימדו אותנו, גם בחינוך גבוה. נתתי הרצאות לפני מורות ומורים להיסטוריה. למה באמת היטלר היה נגד היהודים? מה הוא רצה מהם? מה הפריעו לו? אבל הדברים כתובים כאן במיין קאמפף. זה הספר יצא רק לאחרונה, התירו לתרגם מיין קאמפף בעברית, זה היה אסור כל השנים. אבל יש תרגום קודם יותר שיד ושם תרגם קטעים, להם היה מותר. היטלר טוען בספר שלו שהיהודים הם קומוניסטים. הם עשו את המהפכה ברוסיה. הם הרגו שם 30 מיליון רוסים, את כל האינטליגנציה, בצורה אכזרית ונוראה. ואת זה הם רוצים לעשות לכל העולם. הארץ הבאה בתור זה גרמניה. הם הקימו את המפלגה הקומוניסטית והסוציאליסטית הגרמנית, וזה נכון. אם אנחנו לא נתגבר עליהם עכשיו, הם יחסלו אותנו וישחטו גם כאן 20 מיליון איש את כל האינטליגנציה. וככה הם הלכו מארץ לארץ. כשבסופו של דבר האינטליגנטים היחידים, החכמים היחידים, יהיו רק היהודים. והוא חוזר על זה הרבה פעמים, שלא תהיה טעות. והוא צודק. את המהפכה ברוסיה עשו היהודים. את הצבא הרוסי בנה טרוצקי, שהיה גאון עצום. שונא ישראל שלא היה שני לו. הוא הקים את היפססט כהבריה, המפלגה היהודית של המפלגה הקומוניסטית, שחבריה הלשינו את האבא ואת האמא, את האח ואת הבן. מי שיש לו סידור או אפילו ספר ללימוד עברית, אני כבר לא מדבר על תפילין ומקווה, את הכל הוא הרס, גם אצל היהודים, אבל ודאי אצל הרוסים. בתמונה של פוליט ביורו הראשון, זה כמו הממשלה ברוסיה, מתוך 13 חברים 6 יהודים. מי הקים את הקג"ב? לפני כן קראו לו NKVD, יהודים. אם כן הדברים טובים מפורש. הוא לא שנא את היהודים בגלל שיש להם פאות. הוא לא שנא אותם בגלל שהם שומרים מצוות. בגלל שהם קומוניסטים. והוא כותב כאן בצורה ברורה. היהודים הרסו את הדת ואת האמונה. הם הפיצו בגרמניה את הכפירה באלוקים. כך הוא כותב. אני מרגיש שליחו של אלוקים לחסל את היהודים, כי הם כופרים בו. את זה הוא כותב כאן. אתם מבינים עכשיו למה הוא לומדים את זה בית ספר? כי מי כותב את תוכניות הלימודים? אותם שמאלנים. הם ודאי לא יכתבו שהיטלר רצה להרוג את היהודים בגלל שהם אבות השמאל העולמי ואבות המרקסיזם, קומוניזם, לניניזם. אבל את זה הוא כותב. הרסו את כל הערכים.
The first example of what Foxman is talking about was a meeting with a special advisor to the Ukrainian President Yushchenko. The Ukrainian government would like to distance itself from the embrace of the Russians and strengthen its ties with the West, most especially the United States. They believe that the Jews can become their allies in the US Congress.
We come to celebrate your democracy, but we also come with mixed feelings. The history of the Jewish people in this country is primarily one of tragedy. We would like to see a more active, a more aggressive approach to dealing with issues of anti-Semitism. It took a long...
Foxman is concerned about the Ukrainian government's comparison of the famine in the Ukraine before World War II with the Holocaust.
The one thing that you need to be sensitive about is not to link it with the Holocaust. Be careful that it not be played as your genocide, our genocide, because that will be counterproductive on all sides.
I have a book by Solzhenitsyn I'd like to get to. Thank you. It's 200 Years Together. Last year a couple started translating it in English and they put it online. I included all the chapters that they've translated so far. As a Jewish American, I think this book is very important for everyone to read. In the book, Solzhenitsyn documents the overrepresentation of Jewish individuals in the NKVD and in Bolshevik leadership. He claims that the ethnic hatred these individuals had for Christians played a role in the Holodomor. Jewish individuals had faced persecution in Ukraine prior to the Bolsheviks' rise to power. These individuals exacted their revenge on the Christian Ukrainian population. The result was the death of 4 million Christians. The line of good and evil cuts through the heart of every human. One cannot simply say a given ethnic group is evil. Every individual must struggle with the good and the evil in their own hearts. That being said, it is important to understand what motivates groups to commit atrocities against other groups, because the previous century has been filled with groups killing other groups. Like the Bolsheviks, Jewish individuals are overrepresented in the ownership and senior staffing. I've got a question. It'll take 1 second. So just like the Bolsheviks, Jewish individuals are overrepresented in the ownership and senior staffing of the U.S. news media. The news media also is inexplicably hostile towards Russia. If the current warmongering against Russian Christians is in any way motivated by the same ethnic hatred that motivated the Holodomor, we must face that truth honestly. So here's my question. If Jewish individuals hated Christian Ukrainians enough to starve millions of them to death, could the same thing happen today? Could Jewish individuals use their position of power to seek out revenge against places like Europe and Russia that have a history of expelling Jews? Thank you again for your work. Just remember Rule 9, it's like... Maybe there's something here that you don't know about, And I am trying to just speak the truth.
And I do want to read the book. So thank you for giving me the book.
You're welcome.
I can't do it.
That's okay.
The Star of David, a symbol representing modern-day Judaism and the secular nation-state of Israel. There seems to be no real recollection of how this star became attributed to David. There is no mention of this Star of David in biblical scripture, and has only been used to represent the Jews since the Middle Ages. Before then, the menorah was the symbol of Jewish identity. The star was known as the Seal of Solomon, the great king. Some believe that God inscribed this seal on a ring for Solomon himself. Others believe this is simply an invention by medieval Arabic writers. Still others believe that the seal was invented even earlier by the Hellenistic Jews around 3rd century Egypt. Legend says the seal was given to Solomon by one of his wives, an Egyptian, who was daughter of the Pharaoh. This marriage would create an alliance between Israel and Egypt. The ring was believed to invoke and command demons. The use of this symbol began to spring up in 17th century Germany, originally only representing the Zionist community. In Islam, the one who possesses this seal will become the beast of the earth and will return to punish the unbelievers. 6 points, 6 outer triangles, a 6-sided hexagon, the seal of Solomon. Perhaps the reason that the Star of David, the Israelite king, whose line would produce Jesus of Nazareth, is never mentioned in the Bible is because it does not exist, or at least by that name. But the Bible does appear to address another star, whose worship parallels that of Moloch, whose symbol is a star, the same star.
Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch, and the star of your god, Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon.
Remphan was believed to be an Assyrian god of the planet Saturn, Moloch, Satan. The images have been right in front of us all along, in our homes, churches, schools, at work, and play. The symbols that have created some of the most devastating destruction on earth are the same that we buy, consume, use, and celebrate. In an effort to build the new world order, even the most powerful and intelligent of man will likely require supernatural means. In the case of the European Organization for Nuclear Research, or CERN, the prominent display of Shiva, the god of destruction, appears to be doing just that. The controversial Hadron Collider hosts a massive computer facility and was the birthplace of the Internet, created by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. Lee's mentor, Ben Siegel, describes Lee's discovery.
I first met Tim Berners-Lee in the mid-1980s. Then later, he wrote his proposal and so on. I saw the proposal. And I think the second time around, or maybe the third time around, a proposal actually was looked at, and he was in a position to ask for a computer that he wanted to prototype this on. And I also will never forget the day when, about 2 or 3 months later, I think this was ordered in May of 1990, Tim rushed in my office and said, Ben, it's arrived, come and look. And I went in his office and I saw this sexy black cube, and he was just setting it up. And it was the easiest machine to set up that I'd ever seen. And it was so impressive. And he was, of course, over the moon with this machine. Very soon after that, it had arrived in September, I suppose. By Christmas, he had everything working. His own code, his own system, he invented everything.
The massive Particle Accelerator Lab continues to push boundaries of particle physics, with many believing that the scientists are beginning to play God. The lab has a Masonic number of 23 member states, with only one non-European member granted full membership, the nation of Israel. But the theatrics involving the creation of CERN are as disturbing and telling as their aims. Dark, ominous, and foreboding, strange ceremonies for such a science-minded community. But the idea of trying to recreate the Big Bang or origin of creation sounds sinister enough even to an unbeliever. Equally dark were the ceremonies of the opening of Gotthard Tunnel, also in Switzerland, which is over 57 kilometers long. This ceremony was attended by top European heads of state, where a satanic goat presided over the macabre event. The veil has been lifted. Those who work towards the destruction of humanity are no longer hiding. Their symbols have told the stories for centuries, one that will lead us all to an eventual end times collision. The goal of this series is not for the sake of stirring up hatred, or to tell anyone how, what, or when to celebrate, but to have more information at your disposal to make informed decisions. The rest is up to you. The ancient struggle between good and evil is very real. one that the world's elite have spent countless fortunes and lifetimes on perpetuating, which suggests one thing, that they believe in the entity that they worship with such a passion that they would dedicate their lives in preparation for its arrival. A supernatural event, one that will either lead to discovery, redemption, or annihilation.
Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old acquaintance be forgot and days of old lang syne? For old lang syne, my dear, for old lang syne, we'll talk a cup of kindness yet for days of old lang syne. And here's a